Thank you so much, Erin and Sebastian, for some deeply searching challenges and extensions of the argument. I'll be very brief in response, though, as yesterday, there's a great deal I would love to spend more time on. One or two things, not quite at random, but in a sense, both respondents have picked up the fact that words about these subjects are not what we should be focusing on. That's blindingly obvious, and I fully accept that. That in fact, it's easy to use, as Erin put it, to use rights as a shield, to make the discourse of human rights something which becomes self-congratulatory, self-protective. We care about human rights, you or they don't. And that's where I couldn't agree more strongly. The theological, strictly theological universalism that a Trinitarian and incarnational theology gives us is an essential part of our critical engagement with rights discourse. That I hold on to the legitimacy and usefulness of rights discourse in the face of this doesn't mean that I believe such a discourse is in itself formative of a moral perspective. Rather that it's a complex, imaginative moral perspective that seeks to distill itself in the language of rights in ways that do provide some tools for naming, for challenging, and for resisting. And as I said at the end of yesterday's lecture, there are those contexts in the world where such a vocabulary is a necessary part, I think, of resisting dehumanization. The heart of the question here is what actually motivates us to become persons who enact the right that I was talking about, the right to serve, the right to align with God's rightness. And that's indeed an issue about the kind of communities we're seeking to create. It's indeed an issue about the poetry, the imagination, the beloved community, and the battle against the demonic. And in a sense, what I heard in Erin's response was something of St. Paul's own agonized wrestling with law and right. The law is good and holy and just, says St. Paul, and it doesn't actually do anything. Because it's only the gift of God's presence and God's active justitia which makes the difference and makes the community. And then very briefly, just one or two other points that I heard. Sebastian raised the very important question of applying justice and right to different groups in a way which wasn't simply to do with abstract equalities. And having touched on that here and there in the lectures, I take the point that that is a crucial challenge. And it seems to me that part of what, again, a theologically and communally informed doctrine of right and rights entails is always being willing to ask the question, who's not here and who's not speaking? Who's not here and who's not speaking? That is a question which ought to be a kind of reflex, a natural reflex in believing communities. Because if we can't ask that, we take it for granted that some absences and some silences are just natural, just the way things are. And educating a community which imaginatively responds to this is educating people, I think, in that question. Who's not here? Who's not speaking? One final point to something Sebastian said about the role of religious freedom in the Universal Declaration. I've quoted many times in recent years a saying of the great 19th century English liberal Catholic historian, John Acton, Lord Acton, professor of history at the University of Cambridge. And Acton, mostly remembered for his famous dictum about all power tending to corrupt and absolute power corrupting absolutely, Acton also said the foundation of all political liberty is religious liberty, which is an interesting insight, because what Acton, I think, is arguing there is that religious liberty claims that there is an area of the human in itself which is simply just inaccessible to power. the religious claim that there is a territory where power cannot go, so to speak. That's the seed of a recognition that no form of political hegemony is final, all-controlling. And I think that's probably an insight we need to excavate and elaborate on these days, when sometimes the secular world seems to regard religious freedom as a bit of an embarrassment when other political freedoms are under discussion. And we could do with a little bit of a reminder, again, of how we learned this language of right and freedom and the significance of religious freedom in the defining of political freedom. But there we are, just a few thoughts in response. Thank you so much for your comments.